Hey there, welcome to episode 37 of the Quaggling Sand audio program. I'm your host, Dan Hugo. We're recording this just before noon on Wednesday, July 24, 2024. Today we are going to talk about big versus little. In this case, I'm talking about employment companies, working for a big giant company versus a smaller company, maybe your own startup, maybe a startup with friends. Maybe just a company of yourself, you, yourself, and you. Now, that's the me, myself, and I joke, which I think I first heard on Gilligan's Island, but that's another time. The comparison, my work history, my work timeline, as is visible in my LinkedIn profile, which I will get to in a moment, is lousy with a variety of different types of companies, employers, different work arrangements, full-time, contract, consulting, and different experiences in general. And that is what we're talking about today. So yes, season 0, episode 37 on this, the 24th of July. Let us begin. Hopefully wherever you found this audio program and maybe others, you have access to the episode description where from which I will be reading the summary of today's episode, and there are the links. There's only 3, and 2 of them are the usual suspects. This is mostly a walk down work memory lane, so not too many references, not direct references. And by the way, if you're wondering what does quaggling sand mean, it is the term I coined when I was very young for what you might call pins and needles. So you can ponder that. So this entire channel is about circulation, returning to your limbs, and the stories it reminds you of. And occasionally there might be some learning lesson. Mostly not about interviewing or having discussions, but you never know. But this is mostly a vanity project. Fits in with my others, which we'll get to in a moment. But first, the summary of today's episode. There was a time, and this may still be true, more recently, maybe not as true, but it may still be true, that a great many people in my line of work, which is basically computer engineering, software engineering, comes in many flavors, wanted nothing but to work for a FAANG company. That's Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netscape. Sorry. I worked at Netscape, Netflix, and Google. And of course, Facebook is now Meta, and Google is now really Alphabet. So there's 3 A's and an M and an N. Yeah, who knows? Anyway, FAANG company. Got to work for the big giant company. That's where the big money is. Having been there and done that in a different time, although I did work for Apple, I believe it is more interesting and more viable into the future to work for a me company, either your own company or a company that's more where you can make a difference. So I am part of it. So me. It's not really an acronym. It's just it's my personal title. And you may find the same to be true, maybe. So as usual, in the link section, the shameless self-promotion at buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo, DANHUGO, and Ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/DanHugo. You are under no obligation to spend any money at these, but I do try to use these third-party or out-of-band tools to promote or to link to. The nice thing about Buy Me a Coffee, you have a whole page with a bad editor. And while I'm not a total fan of it, it's more convenient than something like a link tree. I actually do have, and I think I have a link in there, to something like a link tree. I think it's link.bio, maybe, something like that. You can tell I use it all the time. For people who don't have their own websites, something like a link tree is interesting. The nice thing about Buy Me a Coffee and Ko-fi is they are commonly encountered in the world of individual creators, content or otherwise. I've even seen a Buy Me a Coffee link in open source software projects if you'd like to support the developer. It's a well-known interface between people doing interesting things and people who would like to support them in some way. but I use it much more as a way to sort of aggregate my links to my projects and undertakings, whether it's podcasting or otherwise. While you can buy me a coffee, literally, because my projects are powered by coffee, you are not required to. So don't feel that you must, but feel enabled to do so if you want at either of these sites. All that said, the third link of the three is my LinkedIn profile. I will be referring to that later. You can hum along if you like when we get to that point, or you can just look at it. I'm often told that there are too many things on there, but yeah, well, then find another profile and look at that. So now, all about big versus small companies. Let us begin. First, the dream. I loved Apple Computer. I was a big giant fan from the time I first learned the story, heard the whole deal. I didn't really connect the story with like reality, but it sounded like a compelling story. It was really interesting. I used to read Byte magazine, Computer Shopper, or the computing periodicals of the early days, and because of this, Apple. Because I was reading these periodicals, the cutting edge was always on the cover of Byte. The latest Compaq or K-Pro or IBM this or that, or I think K-Pro was on there for sure. I'm not sure when, but Compaq was on there eventually. There were pictures of floppy disks and all that. So for some reason, Apple just struck me as sort of the scrappy underdog, and who doesn't like a good underdog story? Sorry for I had to grab some water, so a little break there. But anyway, yeah, the scrappy underdog, and yeah, like I said, people love the underdog, but I appreciate the underdog. I'm fine with that, but I actually prefer scrappy, which is something maybe because I grew up with entrepreneurial parents or in an entrepreneurial, pro-entrepreneurial setting, perhaps. I think there's a lot to be said for scrappiness, for the sort of the notion that, nobody else is going to do this, or, hey, we can try to do something impossible, or difficult at least. And I always appreciated that. I've said this previously with regard to Intel. I worked for Intel, which we'll get to. I'm really much more of a fan of AMD, and I have always been, because they're number two, or whichever number they had been over the years. They were not number one, and even if they are number one, it's only briefly, because Intel has the big company resources and scale and all that, but it has all the problems too, which we'll get to, my opinions on those. AMD has always come across as a little bit scrappy, which means they can pull things off that shouldn't be doable. I didn't know we couldn't do that kind of stuff. So that is something I learned, and I always viewed Apple as more of a scrappy company. And that was mostly true probably just before the iPhone came out. And then everything, I think, changed. But anyway, that's what we'll get into a little bit. So anytime I had access to a computer, it was usually someone had an Apple II or an Apple II Plus. There was one in the library that I was working in when I was in 7th grade. Some friends had Apple II Pluses, and I had my first experience using those, like, let's play Wizardry, or, so trying out computer games. I first learned how to program on an Atari 800. So even though they were not identical, but sort of similar in technology and level of technology, there was something about the Apple, and I have to be honest, I think it was probably, thank you, Steve Wozniak, the lid popping off to reveal the motherboard, and you could plug stuff into it and all that. So there's just something about it that spoke to me, and I even sent a letter to Steve Jobs, and I suggested that Apple should build something that would today be called a honeypot to try to thwart or distract or maybe even catch because back in these days, the notion of dialing into a computer and wreaking havoc, trespassing, was a thing, the days of war games and so on. And I did get a response, which is filed away somewhere in the family archives. But yeah, I was a big giant fan and loved the Mac. We ended up borrowing a Macintosh. They had a loaner program. So yeah, big on Apple. Eventually got an Apple IIe, saved up all my McDonald's money to buy a modem so that I might engage in some trespassing. No, I actually spent more of my time on the beeper program and getting sprint codes, but that's a different thing. Anyway, I eventually began my college education at Harvey Mudd College, and I decided against pursuing a career in the U.S. Air Force. That was mostly, I was in the Air Force ROTC program. I had a scholarship, but once I was not going to be a pilot, thank you, eyesight, I started weighing the overhead of participating in the AFROTC program at Harvey Mudd, which was actually at USC, versus what I really wanted to do. Computer engineering seemed like a good second choice if I was not going to be flying up in the air. So yeah, computer engineering. Got out of the RTC program, pursued general engineering at Harvey Mudd, but focused on computers. And actually, I have to say that I became more interested in embedded than. So if you want to be pedantic about it, computer engineering is more about the computer itself. Software engineering is more about designing software that runs on the computer. Computer science is more about theory. Oh, thank you, Amazon product. Computer stop. See, that's how much I love computers. My Amazon thing is, the activation word is that word. Anyway, so embedded systems are more interesting, but the science part, you're developing things like artificial intelligence algorithms and search algorithms and data structures and compilers even and things like that. So to me, the technology in general, the general engineering approach to computer technology, I don't want to say the computer word. Okay, he didn't hear me. It didn't hear me. So my plan was not always to land in Silicon Valley, but the job market in 1993 was, I have written in my notes here, not great. That was an understatement. I spent 2 months looking. I have spoken of this before. I had a job copying graduation videos on campus. I was living at Scripps, and I had use of, but one of the perks of Harvey Mudd for graduates was access to the career planning or the career something office. Karen McAndrew, shout out to Karen back when she was there. That's a long time ago. Super helpful, but the economy was not. So we could fax our resumes. Sorry, kids. That's where I'm not even going to try. Faxing our resumes and had access to job listings. And of course, if anybody contacted the school, which somebody actually did, a former graduate, a former student who I actually knew was working at General Instrument in San Diego. So I managed to get myself down to General Instrument and interviewed with 2 other fellow graduates, and one of us got the job in San Diego, and it wasn't me. That's how the grand master plan of fate works out. It was a person named Jeremy Edmonds, I believe, started working there. Got my job. But it's okay. It worked out fine. It turns out that some people that had been working at Ziff Davis, ZD Labs, where was ZD Labs? Somewhere on the peninsula, had moved, for whatever reason, to a small company called Supermac, which was making graphic accelerator cards and some other high-end stuff in the Macintosh market. And they had historically hired people from my college. So they had a chain, like at the end of every year, they would say, hey, so who do you know at Mudd who's looking for a job? And being that the economy was so sour and I was 2 months into my job search with no prospects whatsoever, the opportunity to join that chain and move up to the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and see what would happen seemed appealing. And that was indeed the beginning of a weird and winding path. So the plan, so the dream was to do something in technology after my change of plans with the Air Force and all that flying, being a pilot. But I did, before I was even imagining becoming an Air Force pilot or pilot in general, I had always been fascinated with computers. So it wasn't really it wasn't the second choice. It was really tied for first. So that worked out okay. And of course, being in Silicon Valley, that was like the beginning. Although everybody, so this was 1993, the economy was beginning to turn around as the Clinton administration was going to make big things happen. Al Gore working on the internet kind of ruined that one, so that he might invent it soon after. Right after I got there, internet invented. The truth is, Silicon Valley got its start in the sort of mid 40s when Dr. Terman moved to the Bay Area. He was a radar engineer during the war, very highly regarded, lots of contacts. He moved in, became the dean of engineering at Stanford in 1944, and I guess he was done. I guess they figured, yeah, you can return to civilian life. We got this. And so he moved to the Bay Area, took on the dean of engineering role at Stanford. He is sometimes labeled the father of Silicon Valley. And, if you look at this story and some of the things that took place because of him, then that's probably not too far off. So Silicon Valley was rife for a reboot, unfortunately with venture capital. But 1993 was kind of a turning point. And as I often tell people, it's because when I got there in July 19th, I started working at Supermax. So we were moving on the weekend, July 17th, 1993, a day that will live in infamy, the beginning of the Silicon Valley we all know, and some love, not all of us. So I took the job. I didn't know, so I figured taking a job that was not ideal, and this one at Supermax was not ideal, but it was easy to get. And again, 2 months of job searching. Figured, okay, well, I will move. I will no longer be living in a dorm on Scripps campus. I will move up to the Bay Area. Silicon Valley seems to have some stuff going on, and we'll see what happens. I figured I'd be proximal to various companies. It'd be easier to interview, see who I would meet. I was certainly not meeting anyone living on the campus there. So I moved. I became a tester at Supermax, and it was not what I always wanted to do, but it was educational, and it was mission accomplished. I found myself in Silicon Valley rather than San Diego. And again, that would have been an interesting turn. So I was testing, and then one day I received a stopwatch, and I was asked, the request was in, hey, can you do some benchmarking? And that became my thing. So testing and performance benchmarking. And Supermax was known for their graphic cards. They were in an intense competition with a company called Radius. Hint, Radius would buy Supermax later. But yeah, so my job in the lab was to do these things. Now, one thing that they didn't really leverage at Supermax was the fact that when they hired all these people from Harvey Mudd College, they were hiring actual technically savvy people. Some of the people that were working at Supermax were from like Berkeley, and they didn't have a technical background. They were nothing wrong with Berkeley, but essentially what they were doing was hiring people that they knew from their affiliations at their own educational institutions or from people they had hired, right? So they're doing, and this, by the way, usually is a good idea, is hiring direct referrals. Unlike, hey, do you have any friends that want to work here? Do you know anyone at Harvey Mudd or at Berkeley? So you have a sense of their maybe their background or skill set. But really, in my opinion, looking back, they were not at all taking advantage of the caliber of people that they actually managed to hire from Harvey Mudd College and Berkeley. Although the people from Berkeley did not tend to be from a technical or computer focus. They may have had another technical, more of a scientific background. One of the people involved in the hiring was pursuing physics at Berkeley, Princeton and Berkeley, but he got into marketing instead. So I think some of his connections tend to be more pure science and not sort of hands-on. It came in handy. We had to flash EPROMs, ultraviolet erasable initially, but and eventually EPROMs. So I said, hey, we should get a gang programmer. We could program like 8 of these at a time when we're doing updates to do some testing and performance, benchmarking. Because back then, your new bus card had a big giant flash ROM part on it. I'm sorry, not flash, EPROM, later flash. So they're like, oh, we didn't know we could do that. So anyway, there were a whole bunch of aspects of like opportunities to shine a little bit, sort of a big fish, small pond thing. So that was interesting. And Supermac was a small company, to be sure. I didn't know it at the time because I was like, I don't want to be a tester. And in fact, at the time, being a tester, you can do air quotes if you want. Being a tester was almost like a scarlet letter T. Oh, you're a tester. It's like, no, I actually have an engineering degree. But the job market was, so you're a tester, like that kind of silliness. But it turns out that most people, I didn't know this at the time, but most people, they don't value some of these roles. They're check marks. They're like, oh, okay, we had somebody do some testing. Now, this being July 24th, 2024, if it's sometime in the future, you can look back in time and you can say, hey, CrowdStrike, I remember that. That's when like 8.5 million computers got screwed because someone failed to test something. They rolled out an update that broke quite literally everything. And this should never happen at that level of access. Like if you have access to 8.5 million computers that you're just going to update without testing, that is too much power in the hands of too few people. So the value of testing is often not understood by upper management and so on. So learning this, entering the Silicon Valley environment as a so-called tester, and kind of, I'm not going to say that I worked my way up because really I already had the education. I had the academic side of being in more of a product development, engineering role or something, but I didn't have the experience. And even though the economy was just turning around, and this was the telltale sign was that when I was working, when I worked at Apple, which is where I would jump to next, I was 22, I think. And the next youngest person was about 26, 28, somewhere in there. And then people were older than that. So there was like a 4-year gap. There was simply no one there that was 23, 24, etc. So there was this big giant gap. I don't know why it was so difficult to restart the hiring engine of Silicon Valley. But certainly Apple, as I would discover, was not easy to get into. So yeah, the contributions though of people that are doing testing, benchmarking, they're the people that actually make sure your products work, and they will tell you when they don't. And they are sometimes maligned. Oh, you're giving me extra work to do. Like, I'm actually making sure we don't ship a product that breaks 8.5 million computers and stops air travel and so on. So yeah, the value of testing. And I always tell people, anytime you've ever prepared some food and you ask somebody to taste it, that's it. It's really not much more complicated than that. Oh, should we bother testing? I don't need to test my code. These are all wrong. And don't ever listen to any, yeah, but I know what I'm doing. That's the person you shouldn't be hiring. But yeah, some people believe we don't need testing. We'll test it in production. We'll have the users test it. We'll just slap a beta sticker on it. Come on. Don't be stupid. So I started at Supermac on July 19, 1993. And so we were moving on the 17th. I often mistake those two. So I actually checked. July 19 was a Monday, my first day of work at Supermac. And I was laid off as Supermac began its protracted decline, eventually being purchased by its competitor on October 1st. And I checked, and that was a Wednesday. So it's possible that October 1st I was already fired. I was already laid off on the Wednesday because it was like the end of a month, the end of August. So it may have been like 2 weeks notice and you're out. Or it could have been on the 3rd, which was the Friday. For some reason, October 1st always sticks in my mind, but it's not something there's no tattoo or similar permanent record. It's quite a run, yes. 2 full months working for this company. But, and my first pager, which was silly. But yeah, it was a good learning experience. And what I learned, first and foremost, this is the most glib thing I could come up with at the time. I've probably done worse since. The best time to look for your next job is the first day starting your new job, because you never know. And I've encountered people that give too much credence to their employer, they believe in them way too much. So like, oh, I have too much loyalty to start looking. So, and I'm like, okay, well, I want you to remember that and say that out loud as you're carrying your stuff out in a box. And more often than I have counted, this actually has come to pass. So yeah, you should always you should value yourself first. Take home. So now I had my first job under the bridge, water under the bridge, first job under the bridge right after it. So now I had this opportunity because I have met people, I have talked to people, I can move around within Silicon Valley fairly easily. Things are starting to brighten up a little bit. It's still only mid 1993, but people are starting to hire. I'm starting to get, people are saying, hey, so are you looking? Do you know anybody looking? Are you looking? Etc. So I was, I think I was unemployed for, till Monday. And the other person at Supermac of the two, the not physics guy, called me and said, hey, I just got a call from this company, and I do not remember what it was called. Maybe it's on my resume. We'll check my LinkedIn profile. It was Storm Technologies. Yes, there we go. Storm Technologies. They have a 2-week contract. They're testing, still a tester. They're testing a application that they're writing for Apple. So you just need to go and bang on it for 2 weeks. Well, okay, that's money. So I got like $20 an hour. And by the way, I was being paid $15 an hour at Supermac. I was making $3.85 an hour when I left McDonald's. So a big step up. You're laughing with me, right? So one of the people I met at Supermac, his name was Dave. Dave had worked at Apple as a contractor, and he timed out. You can only work 18 months as a contractor. And he worked at Supermac, and he was well known for always wearing a tie. So everybody, hey, what are you interviewing today? It was kind of funny, but always a nice guy. And he called me, and he said, hey, I thought the whole layoff thing kind of sucked, and it was kind of bad the way that all went down. He's like, you let me know if you want me to send your resume over to Apple, because I know a bunch of people. And I said, you should send my resume over to Apple, to all these people you know. And by the way, this kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. I think it's a sad state of affairs. I did not call Dave. Dave called me. And so he actually had a conscience, I suppose, but he was actually interested proactively in helping out a colleague and making these connections. And nowadays I have found most people are, and there was nothing in it for him. People are much more interested in, I'll go to a networking event so I can meet potential clients, or, what's in it for me. Here is somebody that was literally saying, there's nothing in this for me, but send me your resume and I'll send it over to the characters he knew. So that was also a little educational moment, because I used to do that all the time. Extremely valuable. And again, I don't find that to be the case so much in modernity, which I think is bad. So seemingly moments later, I was done with my 2 weeks at Storm Technologies, and I think maybe Monday I had an interview with Jess Gibson in Mariani One, which is like the first Apple address, the official, where their incorporated entity. So was their statutory address, I guess. Or maybe not that, but it was certainly the address published. If you ever saw an Inside Macintosh, the multiple volumes of that, or various other publications, Mariani One. Easily accessed. There was a bus stop on the sidewalk. Did I have a car yet? No, I did not yet have a car. So I took the bus, a harbinger for the future. Took the bus a couple miles from the apartment all the way down Matilda to Mariani One. Walked in, sat in Jess's cube for a while. It was essentially a confirmation that I was a person and that I was alive and that I could interact with other humans. Basically the referral from Dave at Supermac was sufficient for him, so he was ready to go. He's like, when do you want to start? I'm like, I'm here. So, and I would be working for Apple Quality, where he was like a director or something, or some upper management. Apple Quality, I would be a tester. So not great, except for one thing. Suddenly now I'm inside Apple. And another interesting thing that would become more interesting over time pretty quickly was it was one of several Apple earthquakes, that is to say, shaking up the industry. So it was the time of the Power Mac. So we were working on, I was specifically working on the Power Macintosh upgrade card. We would try everything you could possibly throw at it, applications and just general functionality. We had all the Power Macs around, so the entire crew of people testing it, which means I was working directly with the Power Mac system engineers. So guess which groups I was interviewing with when I eventually got around to interviewing after I got to know them. There you go. So it was definitely an interesting way to get access. I had access to all the internal job listings. I could actually just walk over to an interview. You want to meet up at in the cafeteria, the Mac Cafe in R&D4, and we'll grab a bite and have a chat and so on. So it was probably one of the most valuable referrals, certainly at that time. But as far as like return on investment for Dave, like karma points, like it was a great move at the right time. The value of the layoff at Supermac was, of course, increased. Like, I would not have been doing this had I stayed at Supermac. So I would meet a great many people in my travels at Apple, similar to what Dave did, I suppose. And I was a contractor, though. I was a contractor at Apple. So I, too, had the 18-month limit. We were paid weekly on Thursdays, which was pretty cool. A weekly paycheck is nice. And in those early days, I shudder to think about this now. In those early days, I would literally, because I had to go physically deposit a paycheck somewhere. So I received a paycheck. There would be a person from, and by the way, we worked for external companies. So technically, I was not working for Apple. I was working for Adia, A-D-I-A, Adia On-Site. That's fine. So they would have a person in the lobby of Mariani 1 with a bunch of paychecks. Hey, I'm so-and-so. Oh, here's your paycheck. There you go. So a paycheck handed to you. Those were the weird times. Go to the bank and so on. So I would sometimes have 2 or 3 paychecks that I had not gone to the bank with because either too busy or, oh, that's right, I have to deposit another pay. Oh, the good old days. Even stranger in the early days. So this was, mid 1993. I think Adia was not really geared for interaction with a company like Apple. Now, there were other companies. So Apple had any number of contract agencies. So, which agency are you working for? So everybody I was running into was green badge contractors, and everybody worked for different agencies and so on. So we literally filled out a paper timesheet with carbons. I think it had 3 copies, and it came in like a little gray booklet thing. So you'd open the cover of the booklet, and it was probably like, I don't know. It was the size of it wasn't like 4x5 or anything. It was bigger than a deck of cards, but not much. So you'd flip open the cover of this little packet booklet thingy. So vertical, almost like an order book at a restaurant. So you'd lift that up, and you'd fill out the timesheet. So it was like Sunday through Friday, Saturday through whatever it was, and there was the cover, there was the white, the yellow, the pink. Probably so you'd go get it signed by your manager. Then the manager would get one of the copies and then go drop it in a box somewhere, I think it was. Probably in the lobby. So on your way out for the end of the week, you'd drop your time card into this thing. And eventually they moved to an electronic timesheet. So you'd fill it out, send it to your manager. They would sign off however they did that, and they would submit them. So that got streamlined a little bit pretty quickly. But we were still receiving paper checks, and direct deposit was not quite ready for prime time back then. And it was interesting times. As I mentioned, there was a cap of 18 months for contracting, and this was general, not just Apple. You couldn't work for a company as a contractor for more than 18 months because the line between contractor and employee would blur. That was the take home after a class action lawsuit. And I want to say it was actually against Microsoft sometime prior to all this when I was there. you can research that yourself. Lawsuit, contractor lawsuit, something like that. I did look it up some time ago, and Jess Gibson, my manager with whom I'd interviewed, was one of the members of the class. So he was part of this lawsuit. So small world. So you could only work up to 18 months, and then you had to go away. You had to work somewhere else for at least 6 months, and then you could return. And I knew people probably still to this day are doing exactly that. So they would save up all their contractor dollars. They would take 6 months and go traveling or go enjoy life, and then return to the halls of Apple. So some people are that much of a fan person. Due in part to the outcomes of that lawsuit, though, contractors had a more constrained presence at the company. So part of the cause for the lawsuit was, I'm only a contractor, so I'm not receiving any sort of stock benefits. I'm not getting health or other sort of employee benefits along those lines. So I'm not getting financial gains. I'm not getting any sort of quality of life benefits and features. Don't have the gym membership. Don't have whatever else they're offering. Don't get the discount at the company store, whatever the list of things was going on and on and on. Now, to their credit, you're probably getting paid hourly, which means you were entitled to overtime. So that was actually not so bad. But the question was, if those, at the time of the lawsuit, if those things were not clearly sort of provided for employees but not for contractors, if there was a blurry line, like, wait, am I a contractor? Am I an employee? I'm being paid, and my title or my paperwork says I'm a contractor, but I am getting the discount, but I'm not getting the financial benefit. So the blurriness of the line led to a day of reckoning, right? So as an Apple contractor, your badge was a different color, and you didn't have access to all the buildings, and you technically were not invited to the release parties or whatever, although nobody checked badges. But technically, if somebody asked, no, this is not for contractors, employees only, wink. So it wasn't awful, but it was, you're very clearly not an employee, and nobody really made a big deal of that, except for when they did, and everybody, which was very rare, extremely rare. So but every once in a while, you'd get the sort of upturned nose, like, well, I'm an Apple employee. As a contractor, I did have access to all the internal job postings, however, and that to me was worth all of the other trade-offs for my interest. Because again, I was a big Apple fanboy, but fan people were filling up cubicles and offices all over Apple, Infinite Loop, and all of the other Apple campus buildings all over the place. Apple was all about employees loving that place, not always for good reasons. So the experience at Apple. And by the way, this is about Apple as an example, and it was because it was early in my career and I was working as a contractor at Apple. But I'm going to touch on other companies to make this comparison against big versus small, etc. So hang on. So the experience at Apple. So I worked at Apple for 1 year of my 18 months. I was for the entire time in Mariani 1, which was directly across the street from the main Apple campus. This was in the pre-Apple spaceship days. So big giant campus with Infinite Loop was the street that went around it. And I was almost going to say IR, but those were Intel buildings. Intel IL 1 through 6. So sometimes called R&D buildings. So you were on Infinite Loop, but you were in the R&D complex. You could say R&D 4, but I think they numbered them because Apple's tradition, and by the way, this is one of the fun things about companies, so big or small, it's always kind of fun to have these little lore items. So Apple would name the buildings after the streets that they were on and then a number. So Mariani 1 was on Mariani and Saratoga Sunnyvale, I think. Whatever Matilda turned into on the other side of the 280. So Mariani 1, Bub, Bub 6, I think it was. Valley Green 6 was where the PowerPC team was. Bub was where you'd go get your badge, was on Bub Road. So technically the buildings were IL for Infinite Loop 1 through 6, but however, they were also deemed R&D 1 through 6. So I always walked over to R&D for lunch. If we felt like it, we had total access to the cafeteria, but we needed to get escorted in or otherwise, make arrangements to visit some of the other buildings, unless you needed access to like R&D 5, R&D 3, and then or if you were based in those buildings, then you'd have access to the other buildings. So access was not completely draconian, but it was, like you're not an employee. I interviewed with about 4 different groups and always fell into the same trap. You seem like you could do it, but you really just don't have enough experience yet. And insert your favorite. But how do I get experience? The version of that story. People at Apple completely and totally lived up to the fan person moniker, and you will often hear fanboy because so often it was people identifying as male. I don't know if I want to cause too much trouble here. They were typically the computer nerds, but fan people exist. They're of all shapes and sizes. Apple was a fairly diverse population of people who were completely misguided and felt that whatever Apple did was perfect and could be surpassed by no other. And as long as you were in the Apple universe, breathing the Apple air, perhaps that would, sure, you could argue that. Later, I would learn through interactions with Apple and third-party companies like UMax that like Apple was kind of a pain to deal with, and they thought they were all that, but not really. But everybody loved the company, and they some would wear their Apple badge, which so the badges back then were thick. They were almost like I'm trying to remember. It was like a plastic. It was like a badge holder. It was brown plastic, and your picture was a sticker that would go on the badge. So the brown plastic was like probably as thick as 3 credit cards, and then your stickers on the front, and then I think a sticker on the back about if lost, if found, drop in a mailbox or whatever, that stuff. So the brown casing of the badge had a little RFID antenna and a badge number and so on. So, and I have a funny story about my badge I'll tell in a moment. So contractors had a green background on the front of the badge, and employees, I think, were white, if I remember correctly, and the little colorful Apple logo and so on. And so there were people that would wear their badge all the time. Nobody took their, like, I don't know if they went home and took a shower with it on, but like wearing your badge, going to lunch, going shopping, you could be at Fry's Electronics. Oh, you work at Apple. So it was a badge of honor and proof of employment. Contractors, less so. Working at Apple was more of a practicality concern. So I was not such a prideful wearer of the badge. And again, people really didn't look down. They weren't like, oh, you're just a contractor. Every once in a while, you'd run into somebody like that. But, once everybody knew that person does this, pretty much avoid that person. Very rare, but it did happen. Now, I will say, very briefly, and this concerns the culture of surveillance at Apple. I lost my badge one time. I was working in Mariani. Inside the Mariani building, there were badge access because we were working on unreleased products. So there were different secure areas. So within the building, I had access to all the areas. That was not a problem. There were some labs that were not open, some small rooms, but in general, the multimedia group had like a closed off area so that they could make noise and not disturb people. So that was badge access. There was badge access, and this is stupid. There was badge access between 2 halves of the building with an outside pedestrian bridge. We were on the top floor, and badge access for contractors cut off at 5 o'clock. So if you walked onto the pedestrian bridge and, in the courtyard of the Mariani building, there were trees and whatnot. And you can go out there and sit and have a coffee or something. So a very nice, pretty building. The pedestrian bridge would be literally outside with a cover, but you'd be outside between the 2 halves of the building. So if you open that door and it was 5 o'clock or 5:01 or whatever, guess what? You're not going to make it to the other side of the building, and you are now locked out of both halves of the building on a pedestrian bridge. Did this ever happen? Yes. Did it ever happen to me? No. But it did happen. So somebody didn't really think that one through. But I lost my badge briefly. I reported it as lost, and then I found it. So, and maybe an hour later. So I walked over to the multimedia group, and I swiped my badge to walk into the little room that they were in. And when I say little, probably like 30 by 30 feet or something. So yeah, a nice sized room, but not vast. It's in the corner of the building. I don't even know if the door closed and there was an Apple security person walking through. Excuse me, did you find that badge somewhere? And I was like, what? That badge, is that your badge? Yeah. Oh, because it was reported as lost. They were there waiting. They knew someone would use that badge eventually. So the frightening thing is that I would later hear stories from people I knew who became directors and upper management, not quite C-suite, about the level of surveillance of employees, and like sort of frightening. And that's what we're seeing nowadays with with Apple products. They know everything about you. It's frightening. It really is. So yeah, not bad. I was still a fan of Apple when I departed Apple. I loved working there. Like, oh, this is so cool. But then you start seeing, and I always tell people, like, if you really like a restaurant, never go into the kitchen. So once I started seeing how the sausage was made, to continue that metaphor, I was like, Apple builds closed systems. They don't believe in other computers. So if it's not Apple, it's not worth it kind of stuff. Like, just really not invented here was a big thing. And I would later learn through my career that would cause problems because the Apple way was not necessarily the right way or the standard way. So, and they're known for using proprietary connectors or a connector that they had exclusive access to. Like, yeah, you can get half of the connector, so you can build something to plug into it, but you can't get the Apple side, so you can't build your own thing that somebody could plug into. So Apple would maintain ownership or super tight control over parts and, of course, documentation and so on. They're very closed. And this was all Jobs culture, as in Steve Jobs. Steve Wozniak wanted the lid to come off that Apple II, and you could play with your computer and get to know how it works. And so two completely different views of the world, but Jobs won out. So the Jobs Apple model was closed and very proprietary and annoying. And I found that Apple lost its luster after I worked there. So, I was okay with Apple, but I started really looking at things like open source software, which I had first learned about in college. Oh, what's this Linux thing? And my fan of Apple status began to crumble. Plus, Apple as a company at the time, a lot of people that were not really doing anything, a lot of friends hiring friends or friends of friends. And as I said earlier, there are cases where direct referrals really pay off because you're hiring a background or an academic background or an experience, work background or similar. Did you work with this person? Yeah, we worked together at this company. And you'd end up with like, oh, you have a similar skill set. You already fit together, personality, et cetera, culture fit, right? But I was finding during my year at Apple that a lot of people were working there, quite literally, as I joked earlier. Are you alive? Do you have a pen? And there were people there that you're like, oh my goodness. But this is how big companies work, right? Oh, we got to scale up. We got to triple our headcount. We got to get contractors in here that, as long as they can breathe and a little bit. So I was a little bit disillusioned when I left. I was still a fan, still fine with Apple, but I was no longer quite as enamored. But and the fact that they wouldn't hire me was also kind of a minus. Although I did believe at the time, I was like, oh, okay, well, I don't have experience. How am I supposed to get experience? All that. But eventually, I would realize that really they were just full of themselves. And there was no reason that I couldn't have been hired for any of the jobs that I had applied for and interviewed for. The only reason I wasn't was because whatever their culture was, it was some sort of like, well, I'd rather hire somebody who's already been working here for a while, who already knows everything, because they didn't appreciate the notion that someone could learn the things they didn't know. And so here's a fun fact. If you ever work with somebody who's done the same thing for 20 years, most of their proposed solutions to things will involve stuff that they were doing for 20 years. Yeah, I know. So if you look for people who are skilled, but with a variety of skills and a variety of experiences in their background, or in the case of a junior entry level person, and this is true of anything, right? Like, the question is, do you have the capacity to learn, be creative, be communicative, right? So if you're not like curled up in a ball, afraid of your own shadow, if you can actually interact with people, and if you have some intellectual curiosity, if you have a desire to learn new things, you may come up with stuff that we didn't even think of. And that's happened multiple times through my career. So yeah, it was the sum of my experiences at Apple were generally fine, but some of the individual items maybe not so positive. It's still educational. Don't worry, we're getting to the part now where I'm going to run through my LinkedIn profile to compare. So I would move through Silicon Valley for my first term, and I've already done a whole episode, and I've touched on some of these things, but I worked in Silicon Valley from 1993 until 2001, August of 2001. Perfect timing. I would work at a variety of companies of different sizes and in different roles. So I was a contractor, as an employee, I was a marketing technologist, I was a tester at True Vision, for example, or, MTS, member of technical staff, just a generic nerd on the payroll. I would often take, like as a contractor, I would take a tester role if I knew the person I was working for, because they knew that I could do a lot more than just testing. So it was easy for them to, we just need a QA person. We'll just hire a contractor. So that made it a little bit easier to just kind of work someplace and not be too invested and put money in my pocket. Even that's hard to do nowadays. People don't get it. They don't see the value proposition of I was sometimes called a utility infielder. Like, if you have a thing that nobody knows how, like, I've never done that before, let me take a look at it. Those are the things that are most interesting. So if you have someone with intellectual curiosity and they're presented with a challenging problem or a challenge in general, do they rise to the occasion? And by the way, this is the appeal of hackathons. If you are anywhere near doing something technical and you're not attending a hackathon to find your next employees, you're doing it wrong. So hackathons. Yeah, I don't believe in the shortened resume, in part because of this. A lot of people will say, so when I go, and I'm not going to read everything in detail, I'm going to name off companies, but you're going to hear a lot of companies. I used to tell people I was on the semester program. You make more money every time you change jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But if I just lopped off half of my background at any given time, but those are all things that have accumulated. So most of what I do is based on the things that I have done, although I prefer to do things I've never done. But if I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, my giant is my background. So even if I'm doing something new, the fact that I've done all these other things still does matter. So I'm not a fan of the shortened resume. More of a fan of the CV, the curriculum vitae, which is a general, lengthy and detailed overview of your view of life, what you have learned along the way. So we are the sum of our experiences. That's can't argue with that. I learned the value of a whole team approach as opposed to a hierarchy of important people versus unimportant people. And that sounds bizarre, but that literally happened at multiple places. The contractor employee thing, sort of, although that was more of a legal definition. And by the way, if you want to see the sort of more universal take on that, you can look at I think it's the 20 questions test for whether you are an employee of a company that the IRS publishes. Let me take a quick look here. We're doing this live. Let's see, 20 questions. I'm searching for 20 question test IRS. Let me just see what that comes up with. Yeah, that will get you many responses. The 20-factor test, the IRS 20-factor test to determine whether you are an independent contractor or employee. So from a legal perspective, from the IRS perspective, yes, there's a difference. There's a delineation. There is that to be aware of if you're if you're working in HR or similar. But as far as like, oh, you're not good enough because you're only a contractor, that kind of stuff is silly, unhealthy. So a whole team approach, people that contribute to a team. Now, when I worked at UMax, and again, going to run through all these really quickly. When I worked at UMax, the entire company, which was probably 30 people there were 2 offices, but one was sort of not really. It was UMax Technologies, UTI, UMax Technologies Inc., I think it was, and we were UMax Computer Corporation, UCC. So we were right across the street from Great America. Perfect. So with about 30 people in our office, and every single person from the front desk to the GM, everybody in one room. I think it was on Wednesday. You go around the table, anybody doing anything up, and people would freely associate otherwise. So there was no hierarchy of like, oh, you must make an appointment to see the general manager. No, you just walk in his office, talk to him. So the whole team approach really does work out great at a smaller company. So the value of not breaking people up into like, oh, you're just a tester and you're more important because you're doing this, and oh, only the engineering people get free food. I ran into all this stuff through my travels. Everybody is essential at a startup. There's no budget for hiring extras, as I would come to say. So when you work at a smaller company, there aren't a bunch of people, as there were at Apple and other large companies, that you're like, what do you do other than cause me trouble? Like, no, that's all I do. And it became clear to me through my first term in Silicon Valley that I'm really more of a small company person. I like the chaos of a startup. I know people that completely lose their minds when they don't have, I don't have an app. I must have a Macintosh, or I can't work. I'm like, I don't care. Give me a Toshiba laptop, whatever. Doesn't matter. I'm not going to say forced, but I've had to deal with Windows 3.1, 3.1.1. I've had to deal with Windows NT. I've had to deal with, obviously, Macintosh stuff. A whole variety of things that are like, well, okay, I can deal with this. It's not horrible because, you're getting paid. But there are people that freak out. Or what do you mean? I don't have a phone? Didn't you know I was starting work today? Like, dude, you're working at a startup. Be amazed that you have a chair. So yeah, I mean, some of these things are sort of silly. Now at a big, huge company, when they let that stuff go, when they break their onboarding and so on, that happened at Intel. That's a different thing. That's where like, why do you have 100,000 people working at this company if you completely drop the ball on one person? Yeah, that kind of stuff. So that's being a little pedantic, I guess, with them. But why not? Hey, you have 5 layers of HR management. Why, how can this happen? But at a startup, a little bit of chaos. It's like, oh, I have to assemble my desk. I see IKEA boxes. There's no hex wrench. There's no IKEA key or whatever they call that thing. So now you got to go get one, right? So some of that stuff is I don't know if they do it on purpose. But when you join a startup, if they actually have an office, or when there's a little bit of chaos, or not everything is completely sorted, this is where one of my favorite expressions comes into play. Chaos is opportunity. And this tends to be more true at smaller companies. So yeah, opportunity. It's not something you should be complaining about. And in fact, I extended my saying, if you will accept that chaos is opportunity, I am more interested in people who see the opportunity than the chaos. So that you could use that. So let's run through my work history very quickly. And I was going to write, I did run down my history, but it's actually up because it's newest first. But I'm going to run up. So I'm going to start at Supermac, and I'm going to rattle through these because there's a bunch. So I worked at Supermac a couple months. LinkedIn is generous and says 4 months, but it was really 2 months and just about 2 weeks. The tester, Good times. QA tester at Apple. I didn't put Storm in there because it was 2 weeks and I really didn't do much, just some basics. QA tester for 1 year and 2 months, about, and it was really closer to a year, maybe a year and a month. Very educational, very, very educational, but I was a contractor. Never did become an Apple employee. I was a software engineer, so I was hired as a contractor, then hired again, I guess. I was converted to an engineer. Now I was hired. TrueVision was initially Raster Ops, which was a Supermac competitor. They also made video cards. So Raster Ops acquired TrueVision in Indiana and then changed the name to TrueVision, kind of got out of the graphic card market and got into the video capture. So graphic cards are about 2D, maybe 3D artificial images. Video is about TV, movies, moving video, right? Video compression and all that. So they kind of shifted gears. So while I was there, they were Raster Ops, and I was hired as a contractor, independent. This was my first gig. It's like, you're just going to write me a check. And I got to know the joy of invoicing and how they don't always pay you because you're not an employee. They pay you when they do a check run. And I got to be friendly with the accounts payable people so that they would do a one check run for me sometimes because, hey, I'm a nice person and they like me. So like, okay, I'll write you a check. So that's where it pays off to be at a small company because the accounting people were right on the other side of the wall from where the engineering group was. On the other hand, the company used to buy lunch for engineering and wheel the catered food on a cart through the accounting department. And the accounting department, accounts payable, was paying for that. So they used to ask me every once in a while, how come the engineering group gets free food? Nobody else does. And they were right. And I had a talk with Lou Doctor, who was at the time the CEO of Raster Ops and then TrueVision. And here's a fun fact. When I was working at Supermac and the decision was made amongst the people they were laying off, Dan Hugo, he's in the layoff group. The people that hired me were arguing in my favor, like, yeah, but he does all this work for marketing and engineering, so our publications of benchmark results and this and that. Nope, he's on the layoff list. The person that made that decision, who did the thumb in the direction that said get rid of him, Lou Doctor. So I did point that out to him in person, and he thought that was entertaining. He was a generally nice person. He yelled a lot, but such is life. And I learned from one of the people they hired on as a director of engineering when Chris Kapner decided he didn't want to do that anymore and become a battery engineer. And I would run into him again at 2 different companies later. Yoram Arbel, an Israeli man, very, very strong character. He showed up to our engineering meeting and the room didn't kind of fill up with the dozen people or so that were in the engineering group until about 3 or 4 minutes after 9. And he's like, so the meeting starts at 9. And he kind of laid into people for wasting everyone's time. And he was also right. Having a certain amount of slack might be okay for like 2 or 3 people. You kind of understand like, oh, okay, you're running late, But if it's a matter of course that every week people show up to a meeting 5 minutes late, you start to say like, well, why did we say the meeting's at 9 then? We should actually value the time of others. And that was one of those take-home lessons. He was absolutely correct. His presentation was a little rough, but you got to crack the whip when you're starting your new management job, I guess. So that's fine. I would leave TrueVision after a pleasant trip to Japan. There's a whole bunch of stuff about TrueVision I could go into more for a different episode. And I returned to Apple as a contractor working in the Newton group. My first exposure to the Strong Arm, which was the coolest version of ARM ever. It was a ARM design tweaked by the people who brought you the Alpha from Digital Equipment Corporation. So some cool stuff going on. So we were playing with the MessagePad 2000, and they were coming up with a C++ SDK, a software developer kit. So my entire job as a quote-unquote tester, as a contractor, I contracted for 6 months, and I wrote a whole bunch of test code, and I learned Newton script and C++ and how the ARM processor works and how the thumb instructions work and all that. And I got to know yet more people at Apple. But here's the cool part, I guess. Newton script was inspired by the language self, and JavaScript also inspired by the language self. So later, when I was working at Netscape and I was talking to Brendan of I Invented JavaScript fame, I said, kind of reminds me of NewtonScript. He's like, that's a pretty good observation because both are inspired by self. And so some of the syntax and the proto inheritance model and all that, very similar. Now, JavaScript is not NewtonScript, but visually you're like, that really reminds me of. And he was like, yeah, that's a good observation. I would leave after my 6 months, my 6-month contract. I could have worked there for 18 months, but after 6 months, I had an opportunity to join a company called SCM Microsystems working on smart cards. And to me, that was more future looking. PDAs were kind of in a weird spot back then. And so marketing technologist at SCM Microsystems, which is a company from Munich, Germany, although their core engineering team was from East Germany in a city called Erfurt. Erfurt. And many years later, Erfurt would become infamous, I suppose, due to a high school shooting. Very, very, very rare in Germany. And it turns out that one of my colleagues that was based there in Erfurt, one of their children was at the school but was uninjured. So this was the beginning of my having much more interaction with people from other cultures, other countries, and so on. Obviously very useful. I did mention I went to Japan for True Vision. That was like a toe in the water. But here I'm actually working with colleagues in other countries, proactively having discussions. Flew out to France. Didn't visit Erfurt. That would have been cool. Of course, unification made East Germany history, but Erfurt is still there. The German team was very cool. I learned a nice expression. We work 24 hours in the day and then we work at night. So that one goes to Detlef Janet, who also found the Dilbert comics all hilarious. So funny because it is true. And that was before we knew that Scott Adams was a giant jerk. But yeah, SEM was pretty cool. I only worked there for 5 months because it turns out that their American team was 100% marketing and sales and really had no idea about technology and whatnot. So I had an opportunity to jump over to Netscape, and so I did. I left Netscape to work in the hardcore technology group. My classmate from Harvey Mudd, Dave Carlton, had the job that I would be taking, and he was moving to the Java Foundation classes, which eventually became Java Swing. So basically the Netscape Sun Microsystems doublet was connected through this group in the Java Foundation classes team. And so that was fun. David Carlton was quite a character at Netscape. Partially, but not entirely. He was definitely his own person, very personable, as we all knew in college. His father, Phil Carlton, rather infamously known for his quote regarding the two hardest parts of computer science, cache and validation and naming things. And if you find the extra version, it's cache and validation, naming things, or maybe it's naming things, cache and validation, and off by one errors, because see, he said two things, but it's really three because you're off by one. So that was Phil Carlton. Netscape was a really interesting learning experience. I met a ton of really interesting people. I sat, one cube wall away from Brendan Eich, various other, like a lot of the people that you see their names from those times going on to form other companies and startups and so on. I got to interact with a lot of really smart people. Netscape was a really high profile company. I learned hand coded HTML. So I'm still a fan today. I don't really like Figma designing it. You just make some tags, type in some CSS, whatever. When I was working at Netscape, the notion of dynamic HTML, DHTML, was floating around. So this was pre-Web 2 days. The person on the other side of the cube wall from me was the owner and publisher of Rotten.com. That became famous on Howard Stern show. So yeah, a whole bunch of interesting experiences there. But it was definitely having growing pains. I was there from Netscape 3 to Communicator 4, completely changing the internal culture. More people showing up to meetings from the marketing group, more people wearing ties. more people concerned about Microsoft instead of, like Internet Explorer. No, what about just the internet and changing? No, no, no. It's all about Microsoft and competition and going to court and Congress and antitrust. Like, oh, this place is getting a bummer. When I was working there, the badges had no photos on them. And then they had photos on them. And everybody said, what? Is that how many people work here now? We have to have photos on our badges? And there's just a host of things. Like I think I joined the company at an inflection point when it stopped being like a start. Now it was a big, when I joined, it was a big company, multiple buildings, but it definitely still felt like a startup. And then it was becoming not a great place to work. So I bailed. I actually referred 7 people for jobs. They all received job offers. They all turned them down. And I was invited to speak with the HR person, John Boring. I think he used to work at Apple. And he said, hey, we're just curious if you talk to these people after they turned down their job referrals or job offers, because you referred them all. And I said, I did. And they all said the same thing. You should want to work for Netscape because we're Netscape. Like this attitude that we're so cool. Of course you want to work for us. So a number of things started changing. So I think I joined and then departed during, like on either side of the transition into big company, like corporate. It just was not a fun place to work anymore. So I had an opportunity to join UMax Computer Corporation right across the street from Great America. Small company, like I said, about 30 people doing some cool stuff with PowerPC. Remember, Apple had just switched over to PowerPC. UMax is making Mac clones. So opportunity to work at UMax Computer Corporation as a like cross-platform liaison or something. So I worked at Netscape, had access to all the like Unix platforms that Netscape was running the server on. I did some stuff with RSA and security dynamics actually. Worked with cryptography, but also building our stuff across different platforms. Totally interesting, very valuable experience. And I want to check on something there. And so when I joined UMax, the PowerPC platform, PowerPC reference platform prep, common hardware reference platform chirp, and then later PowerPC platform, PPCP, we're all going to be like, oh, we'll build one design that can run Windows NT for PowerPC and Mac OS for PowerPC and Solaris PowerPC. And what else? Was there another one? And so, of course, I was interested in the Linux for PowerPC stuff. I had, while I was at Netscape, built my first home-built Pentium Pro machine, dual Pentium Pro, and was running Debian Linux on it, which I still run today, Debian Linux, 20-something years. So I joined UMax. My whole job was going to be getting all these different platforms to run with the hardware that they were designing, building from the ground up, custom chipset and all that. One day, the person running the firmware group, which was 3 people, said, the Apple drop doesn't build in Macintosh Programmer's Workshop. And I talked about this last week, I think 2 weeks ago. They were building on AIX on their RS6000 workstations, and it was supposed to cross-compile with Macintosh Programmer's Workshop and the PowerPC toolchain and whatnot, but it wasn't building. So I looked at the drop and I said, well, yeah, the makefile looks like it's a GNU makefile and it's calling GCC and all that stuff. He's like, yeah, they're supposed to give us the MPW build. And I said, well, let me try this on so I took the Mac clone that UMax was making. It was a S900 with a PowerPC, probably a 604. And I built the drop. I built the firmware that Apple had given us sources for. And it worked just fine. And he's like, wait. And I said, yeah, I put Linux PPC and Linux PPC was barely functional. Like there was no there was no X11 running on it or anything. So I basically had a giant command line running on my 21-inch monitor or something. But he's like, wait, you can build this on? I'm like, yeah. He's like, do you want to be in the firmware group? So when you work in a company that's 30 people, you can move around like that. So I was in the firmware group. We were doing system bring-ups. I was learning Forth. I was responsible for RTAS, the runtime abstraction services, learning all about the inner and outer workings of every aspect of a system of a PC, essentially, because PowerPC platform was melding Macintosh technologies, which were sort of off on their own, with the Super I/O and the notion of having a parallel port on your Mac compatible computer. Crazy. So learning about all these systems, how they work, reverse engineering things, why is this working, dropping into supervisor mode so we can enable backside caches on 603Es. The list goes on and on. So my time at UMax was from an engineer, like if I was going to do another year of Harvey Mudd, that was essentially my 1 year and 3 months at UMax Computer Corporation, a profoundly educational experience on many different levels. Plus, we were across the street from Great America, so we would run over there and ride Top Gun or Drop Zone a couple times and then go back to work. Good times. UMax was eventually going to fall apart, so I swung over to Philips Components. If I had it to do over again, I may not have done this, but the reason I was working at Philips was because one of the people, the physics guy who hired me at Supermac, hired me to be his marketing technologist at SCM Microsystems, hired me when he was in marketing. He suggested that I talk to the engineering people at UMax. So I didn't work for him, but I was down the hall. And then he put together a software and electronics business unit to work at Philips. So he was going to be the general manager of this team that was building the software and electronics for the flat display systems group, which was going to be part of Philips Components North America, I think. Philips Electronics North America, which was headed by a guy named Matt Medeiros, who he also figures into some of this history, but not with me. But he's one of the same Silicon Valley people that was always around. So the headquarters for Philips Components moves to San Jose from Eindhoven, which was crazy. Matt takes all that over, and the CBU, the Software and Electronics Business Unit, is going to keep us busy for almost 2 years. 2 years of Philips was 160,000 people spread across many countries, and it was a total mess. There's a joke, I don't think it's true, but there was a joke that after World War II, now Philips is a Dutch company founded in Eindhoven, the family home of the Philips family, the founding people. Is still, I don't think it's like a spot on a tour, but you can that's where they used to live, right? So Eindhoven, and Eindhoven is a cool city. You should visit if you ever have an opportunity. So when World War II began, Philips wanted to make sure their company wasn't crushed. So they sent their company, some of their stuff, to the West, to the United States, and they renamed it so it wouldn't be directly affiliated. So Norelco is actually Philishave, Magnavox is Philips Televisions, and so on. So there were several Philips technologies already floating around in America. But when we joined Philips, and then a whole bunch of UMax people got pulled in as the company collapsed. My third day, I think, with the company was on a plane flying to Eindhoven. Met everybody. I would fly out to Eindhoven again when Kevin joined. Kevin joined UMax because he wanted to learn something new, so he became a board designer with no experience. See how that works? You do a direct referral, smart person gets hired. Have you ever done motherboard design before? Nope. Do you want to learn? Yep. And he was brilliant. So he joined Philips. I was doing the embedded software. He was doing the hardware for some monitor controllers. We were building flat displays and integrated technologies and all that. But as a 160,000 person company, there were little bureaucratic bumps in the road. Now, our group was in a lab in the basement of the first floor of the building. And in San Jose, it was a 2-story building. So we were off a hallway, off the front lobby, and you had to actually go and visit our lab if you wanted to see what was going on. But if the door to the lab happened to be open when somebody was walking by, now they really had to be planning ahead to do this. You could see that we had monitors all over the place and that we had a cable drop so that we could actually test that you could watch cable video and VCR, like analog audio, analog video, was displaying correctly and so on. So we were looking at a piece of hardware evaluating some cable, so like some video from cable TV. And somebody from Marcom went walking by. The door was open. Somebody had just like literally timed it just right. The next morning, how come they're down there watching TV all the time? So that sums up Philips, I think, pretty nicely. It was a very weird company. No company directory. You had to go visit people in other countries to get to know them. No email was not sufficient. So we had to go to Eindhoven to visit the ASA lab and the NAT lab. And I've been to those places since. And yeah, it's cool. Eindhoven turned out pretty well this many years later. But when we went there and visited, I heard one of my favorite Philips isms was a doctor, Dr. Van Leeuwen at the ASA lab. So he's Dutch. He goes, he was trying to find us some contact information for someone to go meet, and he pulls this thing up. He's like, oh, I forgot you only speak the one language. So he translates it into English for us, because Dutch people speak all the languages. So that was kind of funny. But the take home was that Philips, for being such a company of such nice people, was very closed off or very culturally weird, maybe paranoid. Production by a street. But I did learn, by the way, this is a total side note, but we were standing in a little coffee corner. Fun fact, when I was in the NAT lab, the Natuurkundig Laboratorium, which is now the technology hub or something. It's basically a place for startups now. We're at the NAT lab, or maybe the ASA lab is that. I can't remember. Anyway, we're at the NAT lab, and we're there for like 2 weeks. We're working with our Dutch side of our team, and every once in a while they'd say coffee, and we would walk down the hallway to get a coffee from the vending machine, which they also did at Arduino in Turin. So Italian, same thing. I'll go to the vending machine and get a cafe. And so we go down there, and the coffee machine took quarters, 20 to 25 cents, but they were florins. And so they'd be talking, and they're like, oh, yes, it's 0.25 florins. And then somebody else would say guilders, and I was like, wait a minute, is this Princess Bride? And they're like, yeah. We all hear this all the time. So, yes, if you've ever seen Princess Bride and you don't know this by now, guilders and florins are basically the equivalent of dollars and bucks, or other expressions for money used in Holland. So, fun fact. The other thing was that we showed them pictures of like pots of coffee in the break rooms at Philips in America. They were floored. Like, really? You can just go get coffee? And they pointed out that there's a social component to getting up and in a group, walking down, putting a quarter in a vending machine, and kind of milling around, enjoying the coffee. He said, if there's a pot of coffee, you go get the coffee whenever you want. So the whole social gathering, like, hey, let's all take a break and go hang out and stop working and talk about whatever, goes away when you can just wander off and go get a coffee and go back to your desk. So that was an interesting little take home. I had never really considered that. At the same time, they had no idea why anyone would want still water. And I said, do you have like bottles of water of any kind? They're like, no, it's for the coffee. So getting still water, forget about getting it cold, but still water, gas or no gas, was also a challenge. So yeah, my trip that was the longest. I stayed in Japan for like 5 days, and I stayed in France with SCM Microsystems for about 5 days, and UMax I never did travel. Should have gone to China, Taiwan. Should have gone, but never did. So the time I spent in Eindhoven for Philips was the longest in total and the longest single trip, which was a couple weeks, staying at the Dorrent basically in the Centrum. Eindhoven is a cool city. You should go check it out. But eventually I would leave. Oh, by the way, at one point physics guy manager wanted to promote me, or he wanted to say, hey, let's put senior engineer on your business cards. And the person that was going to get them printed stopped it and said, you can't just change your title. So there, like, you had to actually get promoted and this, that. So there was a direct connection. And that was not small company thinking. That was big company thinking, right? So eventually I would leave Philips because it was just not for me. I would work for, which I do not have on my resume, I would work for a company called Motive Power. I do have it mentioned in the software consulting block. Why do I have that there? Huh, that's wrong. Oh, no, that's right. Because of the sorting order, I guess. Yeah. So software consultant is from February 2000 to July 2006. I moved to Phoenix in 2001, but software consulting appears higher up anyway. Anyway, so I was a consultant for Leapfrog Enterprises, building a toy, and I was working on Motive Power, which was an interesting company, but yeah, not going to happen. So that was 4-person startup. That was an education in and of itself. Working for Leapfrog as an independent consultant and having to deal with their accounts payable. Remember True Vision, oh, let me just cut you a check. I'll just handwrite it. Because I'd be like, I'm just one person. I really don't have the wherewithal to do net 90 or some craziness. And they're like, oh, let me cut you a check right now. Leapfrog was like, oh, yeah, we didn't pay your invoice. Sorry. And you're like, it's net 30. Why does it have to be net 90? So they were really a mess, and there were a lot of things about that. But I definitely learned to be defensive in terms of billing, accounts receivable. So that was interesting. I worked for Salon Media Group, which I guess doesn't have an icon anymore. So Salon.com was the only .com I ever worked for. I worked for them remotely initially when I still lived in Sunnyvale, still lived in Phoenix. I moved back to Sunnyvale to work for them as an employee, but I was contracting to do some stuff on their publication platform. That was a really interesting place to be the technical group of people. There was like 5 of us in a company that was completely not technical. Was an interesting time. My first time commuting by train anywhere. So I really started losing interest in cars, the convenience of not having to deal with parking and so on. The company that we had in Phoenix, Home Information Systems, about documenting companies, that was a totally solo and completely novel notion that probably could have been more successful today than back then. It was too early back then. I think now it'd be more reasonable, especially because of there's a company that does tripod mounted 3D room capture for real estate. You could do it for what we were doing too. So we were basically documenting construction projects. You'd have a complete, floor plans, appliance manuals, paint colors, vendors, warranties, everything on a compact disc. So yeah, today it would be a little bit different, but I think it would have been a better match for the marketplace. I was a co-founder at what we called Troubleshot, which was a silly name, but we were doing a new way of writing reviews. We called them micro reviews. So kind of inspired by Twitter and put off by Yelp. Like, don't give me a book. I don't want to know your life story. Like, I went to this restaurant to meet somebody. Just tell me, was the food good? So we came up with this new way and used Bayesian inference to change rankings of things. And so boosting and buck on star ratings on it. It was a pretty cool idea. We actually had some initial seed money, but then that all fell through because the economy started tanking in 2008. Thank you. What was it? The Great Recession, when the banks all kind of screwed up. Then I joined Palm, makers of the Palm Pilot, to work on the Palm Pilot and the Palm Pixie. And I was hired as a QA person, but I ended up doing anything but. And I was on a very small group of people, a small team of people that worked with flash vendors and engineering to prevent the shipping of the Palm Pilot with faulty flash memory. So I got a little bonus for that. Kind of got some notoriety, which I've already talked about previously. That was a fun job, but the politics were ridiculous. launched a podcast network called Radio Sunnyvale with one of my classmates from the Leadership Sunnyvale program. So that was a totally like 2-person, hey, nobody's doing local media, so let's do local media. And it actually found some success, but for the fact that the economy at the time was in a shambles, so not too much in the way of investment from small business in smaller business. But we did catch on in the right places, and it was pretty cool. And so I eventually went on with BTP Times, which was an actual Sunnyvale business dedicated to hyper-local content management and tools development and other, to kind of continue what we were doing with Radio Sunnyvale, but kind of on my own. So By the People Times, still a weird place, but if anywhere you were going to do that, it would be in Silicon Valley. People really didn't get it otherwise. And ironically, that's what my Muni and some of the stuff the Innovate for Vegas Foundation is working on now. So life is a poem with repeating and rhyming stanzas. I worked at Jawbone with several of the people from Palm, because that was a thing in Silicon Valley. Like, oh, company going under, let's all go to this other company and see how much of that we can break. So I worked at Jawbone once again as a QA person, but I never did QA. So I did a whole bunch of stuff with some of the assembly line in China, though I never did visit China, and I learned all about signal processing. And the DSP group is like, why aren't you doing signal processing? Because I knew what a Z transform was, and they're like, yeah, how come you're not doing this? And I said, well, because nobody else is doing what I'm doing, so that's okay. I did 3D renders of assembly line fails across 3 assembly lines. We figured out why certain things were happening the way that they were supposed to not happen, and et cetera, et cetera. Then I got into food trucks, and I've sort of co-founded or something, a 501c6 business league for food truck owners. So I called myself the acting director because we didn't really have a formal management structure or anything. But that was really educational in general. Mobile vending, mobile customers, and interacting with cities and regulations and a lot of personalities. So super interesting, very educational. Moved, so not indicated in here was the house fire. So acting director of the Bay Area Mobile Food Vendors Association until April 2013, because that's when I had my fire and I would move to Vegas. So February of 2014, I interviewed in January when one of my colleagues from Palm found himself at CES in Vegas. He said, hey, let's meet for dinner. He said, you want to travel the world? So started working for Intel in February of 2014. I would like to never again work for a big company. Too much politics, too much empire building, complete lack of like respectful communication if it was going to get in the way of the empire building. Right? Like, we're just not going to help you if your goals interfere with ours. And to me, that's counterproductive. But as the the physics guy for whom I had worked so many times, and I was always want to leave from wherever we were working, he said, I'm impressed that you've been at Intel this long. 2 years at the time? 1 year or 2 years, somewhere in there. I was there for 2.5 years, and then they had the big layoff. He said, I'm impressed that you've been there for a year, say. And I said, I'm still at Intel because I don't have to be at Intel. There was no Intel in Vegas, so I was the only employee. I never had to go to a cubicle and sit there and deal with that. I spent most of my time traveling, going to hackathons and Maker Faire and interacting with very smart people all over the place. How can you argue with that? But they laid off 12,000 people, and they said, you either move to Silicon Valley or take the layoff package. And I was like, 3 times the cost of living? See ya. I started the Nevada Mobile Vendors Association in 2019, but then the pandemic came along and made that untenable. And plus, the mobile vendor community in Vegas is a backstabbing nightmare. Somewhat. There are some cool people, but yipes. I am still operating my consultancy, Really Cool Consulting. ReallyCool.com was my first domain name I ever purchased while I was working in the Newton Group. And I still have it today. So it's my oldest I registered reallycool.com in, when was that? 96? March of 96, I think. Let me we do a quick who is. Who is reallycool.com registered. Where's the registration? Oh, it's up here. March 12, 1996. So I've had this domain since March 12, 1996. And I used to have a nick handle, DH1426, which those don't exist anymore. But so that's my oldest existing email address. And I use it all the time. I don't have a website there, though. So reallycool.com used to have websites. If you go to archive, the Internet Archive, you can see various iterations of a website and whatnot. And I really should put one up. It's on the list of things to do. That list is only getting bigger. So we're almost done, I promise. So Really Cool Technologies, that's all my catch-all for doing any business. It's an actual Nevada LLC, licensed and everything. We have the Innovator Vegas Foundation, of which I am the managing director. We've been around for just over 2 years. And there's Cafe Genius, which is really more of a project of Really Cool Technologies. We'll see how that fits into the sentiment research, collaboratory, and some other things. So the take home from all of this, and I kind of meandered through the timeline, but what you end up with is Philips, Intel, Apple. These are bigger companies that were fraught with empire building and internal politics and just red tape, a surveillance culture. The empire building is always a problem. Little silos, communication issues. Of course, as a public company or once you reach a certain size, the shareholders and your sources of investment for future products and projects become maybe more important. You become very aware that HR, human resources, is not on your side, right? When you work for a tiny company, the HR person probably comes across as your friend. And in some cases, that line is a little bit blurred. But at a big company, you should be definitely and completely aware that HR works for the company, not for you. So you should keep that straight. But in a smaller company, you have these interactions. I described the accounting differences. When I was working at Leapfrog, they were a small company. They were spread between Emeryville and Los Gatos. Engineering was in Los Gatos. The engineering people, super cool. The business people in Emeryville, not super cool. So they used to play games. And in fact, the VP of engineering, who had hired me on to consult for them, said, if I were you, I would invoice early and often because there's always problems with them paying invoices. So eventually I would just invoice every week and they still would play games. So small company does not mean awesome. Big company does not mean awful. But there are many aspects of a larger company that I came to dislike. And after the game playing at Intel regarding layoffs, actually my onboarding was also a challenge. Too many layers, too many people who don't know the other people, too much indirect reference, too many faceless phone calls, too much email, too many policies, too many courses to take. It's fine. Intel is known for being an ethical company, so you had to take these courses on ethics every once in a while. Like, don't take kickbacks, true or false. But so that's fine. But in general, it becomes very apparent. If you're a big company person, you're probably a person that wanted to stay at a big university for 10 years to get your bachelor's degree. Like, you were totally cool with the comfort zone that is a big entity with history and culture and lore, and you're working for professors and a certain subset of the people because there are people that are there for the 10 years. You have a rotation of people coming through, taking normal classes and whatnot. You work at a big company, it's kind of similar. There's a kind of an academia flavor to it. And then if you want the additional joy of building your own empire and screwing other groups over and making decisions that benefit you and your team or your budget, work at a big company. I'm not really into it. So my Intel experience was kind of on the one hand, yeah, Intel's a big giant company. You can travel around the world, and you get the Intel discount on air travel, and because they have corporate level volume purchasing agreements or pricing agreements and whatever. Same with Philips. Fly Philips through Philips had its own travel agency. They had their own global IT department that was a separate company, and that's a different headache, a story for another time. A small company, you're like, oh, I got to fly coach. Like, can you get a seat on the wing? We don't have the budget. But you have to be more scrappy. At a big company, you can get lazy as long as you stay in your corner, stay off the radar. If you don't try to build empires, you'll probably just get shuffled around. I probably could have stayed at Intel for years. I would have been completely and totally unhappy, and I would have been living back in Silicon Valley, which is a horrible place. So, or Oregon, which is also very expensive. So, I don't think it would have been a good move in general, and I'm, to this day, glad that I parted company with Intel. If it had been AMD, that would have been a different story. To be honest, I would rather have worked for AMD the whole time. Sorry, Intel. So the take home of that history. Big companies are a mess. They're political, they're full of empire builders or other politicians that are just trying to, they're trying to benefit themselves and maybe the people that work for them or some of their peers. There's usually little factions running around. Usually not helpful if you're on the wrong side of that faction. And this happened at Intel so many times in the brief period of time that I was there. It's ridiculous. It's no doubt why Intel is shipping products today that are failing 50% of the time. It's really a head shaker. And it's because it's a big company. They've lost touch with the small company they used to be. They have too many layers of management and or silos of responsibility. So this kind of goes along with the empire building. But if I'm more concerned with my budget and resources of my team or my group or whatever, if I have to share with you, that's going to cost me. Therefore, I'm not going to share with you. So our little silo is going to be over here. Don't bother us. And then the layers of management, same problem. Like, why do I have to talk to 5 people between me and the person who's going to make this decision? It's just a lot of process and a lot of politics and a lot of silliness. They tend to lack proper communication. And that is to say, it's really difficult. If you have those 5 layers and maybe there's 2 person on each layer, now I got to get together with, 10 people to get one decision made because everybody has to have their little, their sign off or put their imprint on a document or whatever, have their 2 cents. So once you get in on a group call or these giant meetings, you're like, why can't we just do this? There's probably a light bulb changing joke in there somewhere, but yeah, it's a real head shaker. And the list goes on. There's just big company. It's like moving a battleship, right? It's hard to make a hard left turn in a battleship. You can do it in a PT boat or a yard patrol boat, but big giant corporations have too many. They're too high profile. They have too many people coming after them. Government regulations, unhappy customers, better competition. Like, oh, competitor, let's just buy them. And when people give in to that, you end up with these FAANG companies that are just awful. And most of the problems with technology are because of these big companies or the big money that gets dumped into small companies. To be honest, I would almost rather not work at a small company and receive a big giant cash infusion from Microsoft because that always leads to, disappointment, really. So the difference between a big company and a small company, and then a small company and a startup, or a solo endeavor, comes down to these 3 things, in my opinion. Resources. Big companies, the bigger you are, the more likely you have the finances for employee salaries and capital equipment and perks and benefits and all that. Small company, you have to make do, or maybe make do without. Make do with what you can get and make do with what you can't. Pure scale. So big company is related to resources, but the bigger you get, you have access to talent, you have access to the tools so that you can invent things. You can do things that are not immediately profitable. The Amazon model, they didn't make money for a long time because they kept reinvesting in their infrastructure. So they were scaling. So they were taking those resources and directing them towards scale rather than towards employee salary or like they were not taking profit, I guess you could say, right? So yeah, they were paying their employees, but they're not taking profit. They're reinvesting it into the scale. And that comes back later. And these are big company decisions, right? A small company would be like, well, we aren't making any profit, so everything's going to scale because we want to make profit eventually. And then once you are a business or a company of a substantial size, you get access because of name recognition and you're basically a celebrity. So a small startup, and this is a huge problem here in Vegas, nobody knows anything about startups. Who cares? What are you doing? Do you have a stadium? Are you tearing down a resort? Then who cares what you're doing? So, and that's half true at least. If you're not in the fun economy, who cares? So being, and tech or otherwise, and here in Vegas, oh, you're a tech startup? Okay. Oh, you're not a tech startup? Then why do you even call yourself a startup? You're a small business. You're an SMB, small and medium business. So here in Vegas, you're only a startup if you're doing tech, which is brain dead. So after all of this, my travels, my travails, my tribulations, trials, all that, all the T words, the bottom line, if you can stay small and exercise your creativity, that is really the way to go, in my opinion. And with 82% of companies in the United States, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, you can probably find the same numbers elsewhere. Nevada, it's 80%. 82% of companies across the United States employ 0 people. They are one-person companies, solo businesses, probably consultancies. Maybe they hire contractors as needed. It is possible to do this. Just stay small, do the things you like, be creative, play by your own rules, follow your dreams, do something that is sustainable for you, but also not giving your life away to a big company with what are ultimately goals not aligned with you in the slightest. So yeah, my time with the biggest companies I worked with, again, Apple, Philips, Intel were the biggest. Philips being the biggest of the biggest. Apple, I was never an employee. I was only a contractor. Intel, the most interesting aspect was that I never had to be at Intel, although I visited Intel facilities several times in different places. Great people, very smart people. So no problem with most of the people that were just doing their thing. Some of the empire building at Intel was remarkably frustrating. The incoherence and isolationism and other bizarre behaviors at Philips were educational, but verging on comical if they weren't actually getting in the way so often. But the medium-sized companies I worked for, like medium, I don't know if medium is the right word, but more than 5 people. So the UMax, the Salon, the what else? Even Leapfrog as a consultant. True Vision was really a fun place for quite a while. UMax was fun because of the employees and that we had a very friendly internal culture. We did have those group meetings. So when you're a smaller company, you can do things like crafting interactions and culture so that not everybody's going to get along. It's not like you're all in lockstep. But we managed to form these groups of people who enjoyed each other's company, who worked well together. We had groups of people at UMax that did not work well together. Came to fisticuffs sometimes. But the take home is that in a small company, people actually know each other. They work together more closely. Even if you're remote, you actually can have interactions that are human rather than, if you've ever been on a voice teleconferencing call with 25 people, you're like, why am I bothering to do this? So yeah, big company stuff is just not appealing. And that's me. That's for my story. But the take home, the reason you have listened to this entire episode is I hope satisfied. The joy of trying everything, trying the big, the small, the full-time, the contract, the consulting, invoicing and hoping you get paid eventually, invoicing people that don't pay you. That's Bob Ellis. I don't even know if he's still alive. That guy was a El Primo Jerko. There have been a couple of those. Some people I've worked for during and since the pandemic have been equally troubling and disappointing. The take home is that if you have ideas, there's nothing worse than regret. Try them. Don't give them to other people. Don't give them to big companies. And that's all I had to say about that. Don't forget to check out buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo or Ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/DanHugo for links to my other productions and other projects and so on. You don't have to give any money. Don't worry. You can just go check it out. Okay, it's just a page of links and text and announcements and such. You're more than welcome to buy me a coffee if you like. I can buy my own as well. I usually make it at home. I very rarely even go to coffee shops anymore. That's crazy, even though they're small companies. Anyway, that's where I'll leave it. Thank you. This was a really long show. Thanks for hanging in. Bye-bye.